Hey everyone, Tactics here, and today I wanted to talk a bit about the Season 3 dungeon pool now that we've actually tested all 8 of them and have played with those initial changes that Blizzard has implemented. I'll be going over exactly what those main changes are for each dungeon, as well as just giving my thoughts and some general feedback that hopefully can be iterated on before the season actually launches. I will, of course, be releasing dungeon guides closer to that season launch after a couple more rounds of PTR changes, so make sure you are subscribed to the channel for those. Otherwise, let's just dive into the dungeons themselves, starting with the ones returning from Season 1, so that's Dawnbreaker and Ara-Kara. For both these dungeons, cast times kind of across the dungeons have been increased to kind of fit with that theme that they moved into in Season 2 to make it a little bit more easy to deal with all of these casts. The one difference, though, is that things that are dispellable seem to be made instant cast. So, for example, that curse at the beginning of Dawnbreaker, so it's off the table in terms of an interrupt you need to keep track of, but that means you will need to make sure you have a curse to spell at the ready to handle it. On top of that, I think maybe they've added a small cooldown to some of the bolt casters in both of these dungeons, which is nice. Again, makes it a little bit easier to handle. And then looking at Dawnbreaker specifically, you have those like animated darkness mobs, those little blobs that were in the city. Their cast is actually gone entirely. Instead, they now act like the risen mobs at the end of Priory, where they explode on death, but you can't see it to stop that damage entirely. Continuing with Dawnbreaker, they've adjusted the mob composition in the city a bit, so the pulls are going to feel a bit different. There's a lot more use of those 2 lieutenant mobs from the beginning of the dungeon, so the guy that puts like circles around people and the magic debuff out, as well as the tank bleed guy. Both those guys much more prevalent in the actual city in Dawnbreaker. To make tanks a little bit less sad, the Shadow Walkers, which are those guys with the magic dash ability, that magic damage from that dash has been removed entirely, so you no longer need to worry about that kind of tank damage, but they do instead have a passive that causes their melee attacks to stack a 1% healing reduction onto the tank. So that is something you have to be aware of. It's a pretty short duration at 5 seconds. So if needed, you can use like knockbacks or a CC chain to actually drop your stacks, because these cannot be dispelled in any way. And this seems to kind of be their fixation this season, with a lot of those direct tank busters across all of these dungeons being removed and replaced with some sort of passive on the mob, very similar to the soldiers from Floodgate is what all these seem to be based around. And it's whether it's a debuff like these mobs or a dot or some other kind of thing later on. This one I would say is one of the better implemented ones, because the effect itself, each individual stack, is not very dangerous, right? 1% healing reduction per stack, and it's a short duration at just 5 seconds and can be dropped fairly easily if you need to, and you get unlucky with dodges and parries with just a couple CCs or maybe even your own CCs to handle it entirely. So I like how this one is designed. I have some issues with some later ones, which we will get to when we get to those dungeons. The other major change I would say is to the 3 mini bosses in this city area. The dot that they had, which was particularly dangerous, now deals 20% less damage, so a pretty significant nerf to that. And it also is no longer LOSable. So this was a strategy used in hierarchies to kind of delay this cast almost indefinitely at times, so it wouldn't overlap badly. Now you're going to have to deal with those casts regardless, but it's going to be dealing that less damage. Moving on to our car again, like I said, cast times generally they are up across the dungeon. The dispels are instant cast, so the poison dispel and the spiders at the beginning, that's instant cast. That wasn't interrupt anyways, so it's not really a big deal there. But that is going to be instant cast, so poison dispel is going to be very important still in this dungeon. As a benefit, though, these mobs don't do that circle explosion when they get close to dying anymore, so a little bit of benefit for melee. You don't have to run away from the pack. The other thing which is really nice is that annoying slow when you're trying to do the first pull of the dungeon from the charging mobs is gone. The damage still happens, they still do the charge, but there's just no slow attached to it, so that's a nice quality of life there. The other major quality of life I would say across this dungeon is they have done a lot to reduce the large individual group hits, which make this dungeon I think a fair bit more forgiving. So for example, that second mini boss that does that like 1 second channel that absolutely owns everyone, the damage got absolutely nuked and the channel got extended to 2 seconds long, so much safer for that one. The Scarab guys, the lieutenant mobs in the back half of the dungeon, those guys used to have a big individual group hit. It's now a channel, which can also be interrupted by the tailoring stun ability, so another benefit for that one. So a good job just reducing the one-shottiness of some of these scarier mobs. For tank busters, they got rid of that grasping slash slow at the end. However, The replacement, I think, is a bit worse. This is where, again, I'm talking about these aura things that mobs get. So all those little guys in that end area, which there's a lot of them, have this aura where it stacks up this magic debuff on you, so it can be dispelled, but it's a healing reduction and a slow and a dot. So while this does add an additional form of counterplay to clearing the slow with just a healer dispelling you, the problem is even when you get dispelled, it stacks up so quickly because, again, the density of these mobs in this area is much higher than the density of those Shadow Walkers and Dawnbreaker that we talked about. And so because this can apply on every melee attack, it's a bit problematic. It stacks up too quickly. You get dispelled, it starts stacking up again. And then before it was just an initial hit and a slow, and now you're also dealing with the dot damage, which replaces that initial hit, the slow, which is potentially more than it was previously, as well as a healing reduction on top of that. So I think some adjustments need to be made here. Again, proc rate of the ability, reduce it, maybe reduce that healing reduction or get rid of that healing reduction entirely. Probably doesn't need to be there because in its current state, well, it makes it a little bit easier, I would say, to avoid the circles with this debuff. I think generally the overall tank damage is now significantly higher, and mob density, again, is a big part of that. Way, way, way more of these guys than some of the other debuffing mobs, and that just is a recipe for disaster in this last area. Now, outside of this, there is some really, really, really great changes in terms of nerfs to the final boss, makes it way more pug friendly. This is going to be nowhere near as difficult as season 1. So first off, only 3 players get debuffed with the poison instead of all 5. And second off, the waves have had their damage massively reduced and instead put into a dot. So instead of getting immediately murdered by getting run over by a wave, you're going to get a pretty nasty dot on you, but you can, react, you can defensive, you can health pot, you can get spot healing from a healer, right? So hopefully a lot less deaths and pug to this, and hopefully it's a lot easier for pug groups to handle as a whole. From there, let's talk about the season 2 dungeons coming back, and these ones have a bit less changes because they already kind of fit into the changes that Blizzard implemented in season 2. Starting with Priory, it looks like they really, really want to have people go right this season, which I don't mind. It'll change up the dungeon a little bit. They've done some nerfs to that right side mini boss, some significant nerfs to the knights and their bleed dot that they put out. It's both less damage and less duration, so that'll make them safer to fight. And at the same time, they also buffed the shield on the left side mini boss. It does also say that the reflection amount is increased in the tooltip, but it didn't seem that way in testing. We'll have to wait and see if that gets actually adjusted or confirmed. The other thing, they also nerfed the first mini boss's shield slam, so tanks are going to be happy, especially if you're a block tank. It's both a damage reduction on this thing and also can now be blockable, so that's very, very nice. Tainer with the boss was also made easier. Previously, you could have those swirlies overlap with the boss's leap. They said they fixed it, didn't really get fixed. Now they've definitely fixed it because the Ember Storm duration is only 4 seconds now, down from 6, and then that grace period is 8 seconds. So there's never going to be an overlap here of the boss leaping on someone while there are circles out, which is very nice. And then Cinder Blast has been removed as well from Tainer, so he no longer has that stun on your tank. On top of this, the bleed was nerfed, was 10-second duration down to 7, so Tank's going to be happy about that. And then the random target line attack has also been removed and replaced with a random target circle that leaves a puddle. So there's going to be some area denial on this boss fight as opposed to just dodging that line attack, which is significantly bigger than it looks like. So hopefully no more shenanigans with that, but you are maybe potentially going to need a bit more space, so you may need to clear one of the full sides leading towards this boss. Floodgate has even less changes than Priory. However, I really, really, really like the mob placement changes that they've done in this dungeon. It kind of narrows the gap between groups doing like skip tech versus those just kind of W key hugging this dungeon. So first off, the Blood Warper that was near the box by Big Mama just been moved, so you never need to fight that no matter what group you're in. Really, really positive. The other really, really big positive is Bubbles. He's just dead. He gets murdered by the third boss, and in his place downstairs, there's like 3 soldiers. So huge W changes, like very minimal. The dungeon is pretty similar, but this just huge W changes, I think, especially for people that are just pugging this dungeon. It's just much more forgiving because you get to skip some of these super, super dangerous mobs that previously were just blocking your way. As for ability changes, Big Mama caught a nerf on the Tank Buster again. So again, across the board, Tank's going to be a little bit happier with both this dungeon and Priory, I would say. You also have 5 more seconds before Big Mama puts up that damage reduction. So a little bit more time before you have to deal with that pulsing damage. The loader bots also caught a bit of a nerf here. They take a bit longer to actually activate, and also they deal less damage. So it gives you a bit more time to react to them. Overall, again, not a ton of changes, but I really, really like what they've done to this dungeon just to make it feel better. From there, we can talk about the brand new dungeon coming in the patch, Ecodome Aldani. I personally really like the environment of this dungeon. You get a mix of like these hungering destroyer type mobs back from Castle Nathria at the beginning. You kind of go through, you got ethereals, all the good stuff of course. And you have a bit of choice here when it comes to routing. It's not quite as much as a dungeon like Floodgate or Priory, but it's not just a pure W key, pull everything directly in front of you and you have count either. One thing with the count as well is there are a few very obviously overtuned mobs right now, specifically at the end of the dungeon. There's a few that you often avoid a lot of currently on the PTR, but I expect to see some nerfs over the next couple of weeks. Kind of makes sense, right? Brand new dungeon. Floodgate was similar when it came out because it just hadn't really been tested as much as the other dungeons in the pool, and that's why it got tested the most on the PTR. So I'm not too worried. Maybe it's a little bit difficult when it first comes out on live servers, but I expect it'll get tuned pretty quickly, and it'll still have quite a few passes more on the PTR. When it comes to the bosses, they're pretty interesting. There's like a good mix of different damage types. You got a bunch of ad spawns on the first boss that you need to burst down. You got 2 target cleave on the second boss, and then you have this like damage amp slash damage downs on players if you don't do the mechanic or not, where you have to like grab your echo on the last boss. Those pesky DPS players have to actually do the mechanic or their damage goes into the gutter. One thing I will say, at the end of the dungeon, there are these siphons that you can channel into to get a buff. It's a 10% haste and move speed buff for 20 seconds, which is nice in theory, but I think currently the time it actually takes to channel isn't worth the short duration and small value of the buff that you actually get. But I think they could do something like maybe triple that duration, make it a 1 minute duration of the buff, and then remove a bunch of the siphons in the area so you just don't have the buff every pull, and maybe have like 3 of them total in this whole area. And then maybe that's something players think about actually how to use and make the best out of, and maybe do pulls around that. I think that would be kind of cool. So longer buff and less total siphons is what I think. But overall, cool dungeon, a bit overtuned, like I said, for live servers if it went live as is, but I expect a lot of changes to this before it actually reaches live servers in the dungeon pool. But again, it's kind of expected with it being the only brand new dungeon we're seeing this season. And then we can talk about the returning Shadowlands dungeon. So we've got Tazavesh, which of course is split into Streets and Gambit. Let's talk about Streets first. I think they've made some good improvements to make the first boss less frustrating. You no longer need to deal with that spinning shield around the boss. You get a longer buff when your weapon gets taken away from you, so it actually feels like a benefit, that kind of stuff. The Bazaar event was also made significantly quicker and potentially something you'll actually do as a group. Like back in the day, you would occasionally just send like a rogue or a hunter or something to go solo this while the rest of your group was doing other stuff. So with how they changed it, I think it's a net positive. That being said, I still would like to see further RP reductions in this dungeon. They've reduced the timer by 7 minutes, and they've reduced some of the RP a little bit, but they need to go further, I think, to match that 7 minute reduction. So like the RP before you can actually even start the Bazaar event, too long. Just let us immediately start it. Have that guy that can give you the initial item just ready to go when you get there. Same thing with the Menagerie. They said in the notes they reduced the RP. They definitely did. This was like a boss you would have someone like run over to really early in the dungeon, so the RP would just be done. You'd like kill another boss in the meantime. Let's just cut this RP down to like 5 seconds tops or something, because it still feels like it's quite a bit of time you're sitting in that room waiting for this mob to spawn, and like our RP is just no fun. Like we don't want to sit there waiting for the boss to RP to spawn. Let's cut that out. Same with the band area. There's definitely decent amount of time between some of those pulls in that band boss, the Oasis. So cut it down a little bit. I think all 3 of those areas you can cut down maybe close to a minute of RP. I'm actually not sure the exact number, but you can cut down quite a bit of RP in this dungeon, and it just makes it flow nicer when there's less RP. I will say the changes they made to the last boss, so Asmi, making them more consistent, super nice. Maybe she was bugged out on our run, to be honest with you. She only ever changed the location of our portals once, but in general, just the Vide timings, the ring timings, they felt a lot better on this boss, which I remember sometimes could be very, very troll back in Shadowlands. Moving on to Gambit, I have a few more critiques here. In the initial stage of the dungeon, I think Fish Stick is still quite a bit of a problem. It still functions as like a totem, so it's hard to kind of cleave, especially with the massive pack sizes in this area. They did increase the duration on the cast, which is nice. However, it still just kind of encourages you to have this infinite CC chain to just never let a fish stick go off, which I don't think is what they want to encourage. So I think there's a couple changes they could make. One, you could just make this interruptible instead of the cry ability, which is the AoE and rage. You can make the cry the one that you can't interrupt, and then you can make fish stick interruptible, essentially making it interrupt. That would get rid of the mechanic entirely and the issue. If they don't want to get rid of it, I think what they should probably do is take inspiration from the Cinder Brew barrels, where it can be cleaved like a regular mob, first off, instead of a totem, which is very, very annoying. And then they have a cast time where when that cast time completes, then it would heal. And then maybe instead of the barrels, which explode and disappear, it would just continue this casting because it's a totem. And so it would continue trying to heal until it's killed. That would give you some more counterplay, right? It wouldn't be the end of the world if it dropped on the ground, because it wouldn't instantly start healing the 30 mobs or whatever you're fighting at once. Instead, give it a cast time. And if you had the ability to swap to it and kill it before that cast time went off, you're feeling great, right? You're not feeling punished because, oh, we accidentally missed CC7 in our CC chain, and now we have two fish sticks on the ground which are immediately ticking for healing, and it's healing constantly this entire pack, right? That feels really, really overly punishing. And even if it's just one, it feels overly punishing. So if they want to keep it in and they want to keep it uninterruptible, I like the idea of moving it towards those barrels from Cinder. I think those were a really, really cool mechanic in terms of handling those new totem-like things that aren't actually totems. In terms of grade changes, Hillbrand, the first boss, everyone can see the Titan console when someone channels into it, so you can just see the pattern. No longer do you need some weak aura in pugs to make sure that everyone knows where things are supposed to go, yelling it out in comms or whatever. Now you just look at the front and you can see exactly where the colors go, which is great. I believe the old version is now like the hard mode mechanic, so it's still there in some ways, but in Mythic Plus, you will not need to deal with that. One thing I will say about kicks is I think they need to do another pass in this dungeon. The end of the dungeon, super, super kick heavy. So you've got spam casters who, again, they're just spamming. They don't have that short cooldown like we're seeing in maybe Dawnbreaker and Ara-Kara, where they will like pause for a couple seconds between casts. These guys are just spamming. And on top of that, these same spam casters have a 100% must interrupt AoE damage ability, otherwise everyone dies. And then on top of this, the other majority mob in this area will do a healing cast at low health. So there's just so many kicks here. There needs to be some other form of counterplay to them. Maybe, for example, the AoE damage, instead of being a hit, is like an AoE channel. Think the spiders at the beginning of our Ara-Kara, for example. They have the bolt and they have the channel, so you can use a CC instead of a kick on that channel. You can still kick it, but you can also use a CC to save yourself some kicks. You could also do something like make that heal, instead of a one big healing hit, make it a purgeable hot on the mob. Something, again, just to reduce the number of kicks actually required in this area, because again, outside of a massive CC chain similar to those fish sticks earlier, there's not a lot of ways that groups can handle this area. Last up, we have Halls of Atonement, where this is the dungeon they've gone crazy with those tank-related passive abilities on mobs. So you have the frontal guys from the beginning. That frontal is gone. They now just have a buff on them that causes them to stack up a damage taken increase magic debuff on the tank. This debuff is not super scary on its own. However, it does potentially cause issues because there's often obliterators in this area, and those guys put out a pretty nasty curse onto people. So all of a sudden, if your healer's dispel has to be committed to your tank, you're now required to have like 1 to 2 other curse dispels in your group to deal with those curses going out as well. It can't be your healer, because your healer needs to focus on your tank. So there is potentially a conflict there in dispels that they should consider. The Gargans also have a passive ability that causes them to stack bleeds on their melees, and similar to those guys in Ara-Kara, this just stacks up too quickly. Now, there isn't a billion Gargans you're going to pull at once, right? It's usually in twos you're dealing with these Gargans, but with how dangerous the dot is, how quickly it stacks, and then how few ways there actually are to remove bleeds, right? It's just Dwarf, Racial, and Evoker that can remove them. So it might be beneficial, again, similar to the Ara-Kara guys, if there's just a reduction in the proc rate, or maybe even in the Guardian's case specifically, you just turn this into an ability that applies a bleed, and that way you know that your max bleed count is the number of Gargans in the pack, right? You're not going to have 4 Gargans that stack you up to like 17 stacks of this bleed and just absolutely murder you the instant your CDs run out. Instead, you're going to have 4 stacks of the bleed. You can CD that, and then you can wait for that to fall off, and then you'll be good for a little while. Something like that I think would probably be better for this ability specifically because it is a bleed. But again, reducing the chance that they can apply it on their melees also works, or just reducing the damage it does significantly if they want to keep it as is. Either would work. The other thing with this dungeon in particular is there's a few instant cast abilities. I think the most problematic one is the throw glaive or glaive throw ability from the Eviscerator between the first and second boss. This does like an AoE cleave around the target, and I think this should have a cast time and a visual just so people know what's going on, because we didn't really know what was going on a lot of the times when people were getting absolutely owned in this area. And it turns out, it's the combination of the Eviscerator cleaves with the leapers. There's also these little guys in this area that do an instant target leap as well. So it's the wombo combo of that, and then everyone being stacked and that kind of stuff made for issues, and it's not clear. And I think this should be made clear, specifically the Eviscerator thing. The little guys leaping, you can kind of see that they're leaping at people, but the Eviscerator cleave was not clear at all, really. So that is something that I would like to see improved. And the other thing was that the last boss was just a bit overtuned. I think a lot of people had struggles on this last boss. The beam dam in particular was quite scary. So maybe a reduction of some kind on that beam damage, which would also make it a little bit more forgiving if you let the beam pick a time or two on one of the statues. The other thing, melee are going to be absolutely in hell on this boss because the 14-yard circles around the boss and all the statues happen. Maybe reduce the size on this, maybe 12. I'd like to see 10 and see about 10 yards, seems like, but at least 12 yards on the circles instead of 14 would definitely be welcome for all the melee players. Overall, I'm pretty excited for the season. I think they've made a lot of great changes in removing some of these tank busters, changing one-shotty group damage to be more damage over time, adjusting the cast times and spell CDs of some of these abilities as well, just to make pulls easier to handle, right? There's a lot of good changes. There's definitely still some spots where they need some work, but I think this is going to be another great season, just like Season 2, and I can't wait to hop in when the patch releases. I would love to know what you guys think, though. What dungeon are you most looking forward to? Let me know down in the comments below, and of course, make sure you are subscribed to the channel because we've got a ton of videos coming your way regarding Season 3 over the next couple of months. As always, thank you to all my amazing Patreon supporters for making all this content possible, and I'll see everyone in the next video.